So, how did French actress Annie Briand come to star in a Joe D'Amato Italian horror film featuring 6'9" monster George Eastman? Well, we'll get there. But first, I think it's worth noting that today, Annie may be best known for appearing in a pair of video nasties, Absurd being one of them, and House on the Edge of the Park being the other. Why is this? Well, without getting into a sociological discussion about why people love horror films, it's fair to say that the genre has historically been well represented, not to mention easily accessible, on home videos since the early days of VHS. Case in point, the recent ultra high definition upgrades of both House on the Edge of the Park and Absurd by Severin Films in the United States and 88 Films in the UK. But before she was a video star, Annie was a world famous erotic star, discovered by British Euro pudding producer Harry Alan Towers in 1975, who proceeded to dye her hair platinum blonde, cast her in a series of Emmanuel clones, and rechristen her Annie Belle.
Annie! What in the world have you done to your hair, for goodness sakes?
Not bad, huh?
And the color. What's the school going to say about it?
I don't want to go back to school. But if I have to, I can wear a wig.
But before that, discovered at the age of 16 on a Parisian boulevard and cast in one of Jean Rollon's early softcore sex films. While Annie's career didn't start with Harry Alan Towers, he did make her an international star. But she grew tired of the Towers formula pretty quickly and asked for an early release from her contract. It says something about Annie's strength of personality that Towers let her go without putting up much of a fight. I think he understood that there was no caging this wild bird. Now free of Mr. Towers of London, Annie entered her most creatively fertile period, starring in a number of personal, political, and experimental projects unlike anything she had ever done before, or would do after. In one of those films, she went to Spain to play a schoolgirl drug addict. For another, she got to act alongside Laura Antonelli and Marcello Mastroianni. Pretty big names for little Annie, who at this point was only 20 years old and had only been in the business for 4 years. But by the time we get to the early 80s, we find Annie as just another working actress based in Rome, trying to navigate to the best of her abilities the ever-changing cinematic landscape of the Italian film industry. If you wanted work, you couldn't be too choosy, and the projects being exported by people like Lucio Fulci, Lamberto Bava, and Joe D'Amato were being made to order for the international home video market. And as we see with Absurd, a spiritual sequel to Anthropophagus, these films were not only cannibalizing their own prior success, but were created with familiar Hollywood hits in mind. We're talking The Exorcist, The Shining, and most recently, Friday the 13th. All three of these films would influence the script for Absurd, which was hammered out with contempt by its hulking star, Luigi Montefiore, aka George Eastman. But as I mentioned, Absurd was not Annie's first horror film. Previously, she brought her French classiness to Ruggero Deodato's House on the Edge of the Park, the director's Cannibal Holocaust follow-up. That film was quickly shot in September of 1979, but not released in Italy until late 1980, after the heat died down. Unlike Absurd, that film actually played theatrically, and was important in establishing that the ever-adaptable Annie was more than game to play the part in Italian horror thrillers. This paved the way for her role in Absurd, which began production in July of 1981. This time, though, Annie was able to keep her clothes on. She didn't have to perform pretend sex with David Hess, and she was cast in the unglamorous role as the nurse and in-home caretaker to a young girl in Traction. Coincidentally, a healthcare role not far off from one she would play in real life after she left the movie business.
How long ago did Peggy leave? Oh, about 10 minutes before you got here.
I think that answers the question of where Annie was professionally at this time, but personally and romantically, at this point she had split with actor and frequent co-star Al Cliver, real name Pierluigi Conti, and was currently living with film producer Diego Spataro, a longtime friend and collaborator of Absurd's director Joe D'Amato. Spataro actually helped write and produce D'Amato's very first film as a director, a Trinity-inspired Euro-Western which Spataro signed using his infamous nom de plume, Dick Spitfire. So through Spataro, we see Annie entering the Joe D'Amato verse, which was an easy place in which to get lost. Just ask Laura Gemser and Gabriele Tinti. The fact is, Joe D'Amato was a fun guy. Everybody loved Joe. Numerous cast and crew have said that when you were on a Joe D'Amato set, it was like being with family. There's a reason why Laura stayed with him until the very end, even when she was past the point of performing and was happy to play costume designer behind the scenes. And on that note, Absurd was actually planned as a Laura Gemser and Van Johnson vehicle, with Gemser presumably playing the Annie Belle role and Johnson playing the part that eventually went to Edmund Purdom. But back to Joe. He had a special knack for making his performers feel safe and comfortable on set, even when they were asked to do heinous things for the camera.
Oh, God! You're hurting me! Let me go!
Annie said as much when she was interviewed about her career for Nocturnal Magazine's 99 Women special edition issue. In that interview, Annie remembered more about the production of The Alcove, her second and final film with D'Amato in 1985. But for Absurd, her strongest memory was the hours she spent in the makeup chair to give her face the appearance of having been broiled by a conventional oven. It was Annie's first up-close and personal experience with Italian-style gore effects, so it's understandable that it left a strong impression. She was especially amused by all the tubes and syringes used to spurt fake blood, which she remembered had a tendency to comically malfunction. A familiar story to those who worked on Roman splatter films. But other than that, Annie remembered Luigi Montefiore and how he was very careful not to hurt her during their rough scenes together. But most of all, she remembered Luigi as a nice guy and said that their friendship extended beyond the film set. She would often stop into his pizza restaurant in Piazza Navona in Rome, which was known as a sort of informal meeting place for artists and actor types. It's worth noting that at the time, these were the circles in which Annie ran. By her own admission, she did not hang out with the ladder climbers or the movie star types. She hung out with painters and writers and artists on the fringes. You can see some of these people in the experimental film Molto di Più, which was directed by a friend of Annie and Al Cliver's named Mario Lenzi. It's an incredible film, sort of a last gasp look at La Dolce Vita, an aimless, loosely documentarian glimpse at the vibrant and artistic youth in Rome, who would eventually be scattered to the wind when the Italian film industry gave way to television.
Dammi un bacetto. No, dammi troppo alto.
But I could talk all day about Motel Depew. What I'm trying to say is, for Annie, absurd was a job, one that she brought her usual professionalism to, but most importantly, it was a film which introduced her to the uniquely grotesque Italian horror scene. It wouldn't be her last in this mode. She would appear in a pair of odd thriller/horror films at the end of her career, but it's clear that this wasn't necessarily her genre of choice. But as in the case of Absurd, working with friends and lovers is sometimes more important than being creatively fulfilled. Annie's career was always full of these kinds of surprises, adventures, and left turns. But that's what makes it so interesting, and why I've written a whole book about it.
Đói bụng quá. Kẹo. Cho cái kẹo.
Ça va? As-tu faim?
What else can we say about Annie and Absurd? Well, around the halfway mark, she performs an incredibly believable trip and fall while walking in the woods. Look closely. That's no stunt woman. That's all Annie. We can also talk about Annie's young co-stars, the two actors she spends the most screen time with, the Burger children, Katya and Casimir. Absurd was very much a family affair, with the two kids being accompanied by their mother, Hanya Kochansky, who also plays their mother in the film. This wasn't Annie's first brush with the Burger clan, nor would it be her last. Previously, she had acted alongside the Burger patriarch, William, in director Marco Vicario's aforementioned period drama, Wife Mistress. And 2 years after Absurd, Annie would reunite with Katya, very briefly, in the Canon Films adaptation of Emile Zola's erotic novel, Nana. In that film, Annie plays the spurned fiancée crying through a wedding veil, and Katya plays the pleasure-seeking nymphette. In another world, at another time, Annie would have played the lead role. But by 1983, she was intentionally trying to move away from her typecasting as an erotic starlet. Nevertheless, I think she would have made a great Nana.
Hector! Hector!
Where did Annie go from here? Well, to shoot some guns in the war-torn Philippines, and then to southern Italy to play the love interest to various Neapolitan singers, and then back to France to study, paint, and host a radio program about astrological signs, among other things. But those are stories for another day, or better yet, another chapter.
Leaving so soon? I have to run home before I go out to the Bennetts. See you tomorrow. Bye, Sergeant.
See ya.
So long. She's a great girl. Wasted in a place like this.